The Clone Wars were one of the biggest conflicts in galactic history, and it may well have been one of the bloodiest too. Every day during the war saw the deaths of untold thousands across hundreds of battlefronts, and the Republic was hard-pressed to keep the Grand Army in working condition. The Confederacy's numbers advantage made things worse, and as a result, clones were stretched thin across the galaxy until the very end of the conflict. But just how thin was the GAR stretched? In this video, we'll be answering that question.
Attention, Sergeant on deck!
First things first, we need to open a can of worms. Just how large was the Grand Army of the Republic? Legends has an answer for us: 3 million clone troopers strong. Canon's a bit more iffy, but the number is implied by several sources to be around 3 million too. There's just one problem with this though. It's total BS. 3 million clones equals 3 clones for every star system in the Republic. Not planet, star system. We know the clones weren't the entirety of the Republic military, and that recruited soldiers in the planetary security forces dealt with a significant chunk of the battles, but 3 million still just doesn't cut it. It's absolutely tiny, even if it's just taken as a starting number, to be the core of a military force fighting a galactic scale war. As a result, we're going to throw those numbers in the trash completely and see if we can't work out something that makes more sense. We get estimates other than 3 million in both Legends and Canon, so let's take a look at those real quick. The first statement we get about the size of the clone army came in Attack of the Clones when Lama Su, the Prime Minister of Tipoca City, said that 200,000 clone units were ready, with 1 million more well on their way. Legends further establishes that those 200,000 clones were deployed with the Battle of Geonosis, and that the other million were deployed about 2 months later, after the first Battle of Kamino. Both Legends and Canon also affirm that Tipoca City wasn't the only facility on Kamino producing clones, just the largest. Furthermore, Star Wars The Clone Wars establishes that the Republic deployed an additional 5 million clones per year. Here's the thing though, when Lama Su was talking about the numbers of clones being produced, he didn't specify what units meant. Canon interprets it to mean individual clones, but that wasn't necessarily the case. He could actually have been talking about military units, which is to say platoons, companies, battalions, or something like that. Platoons would have made the most sense, as after all, clones were sorted into them from birth, and the bond of the platoon was emphasized even when they were split into squads. A platoon was 36 clones plus officers, so 1.2 million platoons would be over 43 million clones from Tipoca City alone. For the sake of simplicity, let's say the whole starting force was 100 million clones strong, a much more reasonable number for a galactic scale war. It's still not enough, of course, hence the GAR still being stretched even with the PSFs involved, but it's much more realistic than bloody 3 million. Of course, this was just the first batch. About 1/6 of those clones would have been deployed originally, and the rest would have followed after Kamino, but there's still the matter of reinforcements. Kamino was constantly shipping new batches of clones to the front lines. In all likelihood, they had begun preparing reinforcement waves way in advance, and they probably delivered a few million clones, let's say 5 million in light of that one Clone Wars episode, to the front lines every month or so, albeit only after the Senate paid for them. This, more or less, would have counterbalanced casualty rates, keeping the Grand Army at more or less the same strength for most of the war, albeit with a steady but minor decline. Between the first Battle of Kamino and the Battle of Coruscant, which is to say most of the Clone Wars, the Grand Army of the Republic would have had between 90 to 100 million clones active at any given point in time, divided between various duties. So with that out of the way, let's talk about how those numbers were distributed. As we discussed in our recent video on the theaters of war, the Grand Army of the Republic was divided into 10 systems armies, which in turn contained 2 sector armies each. The galaxy was divided between these 20 sector armies, each of which had a capital world and its own way of doing things. For the sake of this video, we're going to be assuming that clones were distributed more or less evenly between the sector armies, which would have meant 5 million clones for each, though as we mentioned in the last video, some of the Corwood sector armies sent most of their troops over to reinforce those operating in problematic theaters. The sector armies, like systems armies above them, were mostly a large-scale organizational unit. The largest clone divisions that operated as a singular unit were corps, which contained about 40,000 men. In light of what we're assuming the numbers of the Grand Army to have been, the number of corps and sector armies would have been changeable, though it would have been fairly high at any given time. Of course, clones didn't always operate in corps either. Most of the time they operated in smaller units. Each corps was divided into 4 brigades, otherwise known as legions, which in turn were divided into 4 regiments, and so on with battalions, companies, platoons, and squads, each of which were a quarter of the size of the unit above them. But these units weren't divided up willy-nilly or as the situation dictated. There was in fact a concrete strategy of dispersion. Enter the 1-4-16-64 plan. In this plan, a regional army of 4 corps would divide each of its corps up differently, with each serving a specific role. One corps would remain intact, serving as a mobile armored reserve. Another would operate as 4 brigades, each capable of a decently large planetary operation. The third would work as 16 regiments, largely intended for mid-tier missions or defensive garrisoning. And the last corps would be split into 64 battalions, which would serve as fast-moving rapid response or raiding units. Obviously, this plan was written with the Legends number of 3 million clones in mind, but we can assume that the sector armies were just divided proportionately. With that said, how would this have worked in practice? Things would have been different between sector armies to start. The first sector army, which protected Coruscant in the heart of the core worlds, only had 3 small pockets of separatist space to contend with, namely around Foros, Skako, and Scipio, and so their troops were either dedicated primarily to defensive garrisons or sent off to problem sectors to serve as reinforcements. The 12th Sector Army, on the other hand, had next to nothing to defend, as nearly all of its region of jurisdiction was separatist space. And so, nearly all the clones there were sent right to the front lines of the Felucia Theatre, with only a few remaining behind to garrison its most crucial worlds. That said, permanent clone defensive garrisons on Loyalist worlds would generally have been pretty small. Remember, the planetary security forces were part of the Republic military too, and recruited soldiers from those corners provided the defensive garrisons for most planets. Clone garrisons were reserved for worlds with tactical importance, like Coruscant, sector army capitals, key shipyards, crossroads, and supply worlds. Even then, they were more often a supplement for local garrisons. Few planets would have had permanent defensive garrisons larger than a regiment, which is to say about 2,000 clones. A few dozen important worlds, like the sector army capitals, could have had resident brigades, and if any worlds had full corps dedicated to their defense, it was probably just Coruscant. That said, these defensive garrisons were likely often inflated by reserves, especially worlds close to the front lines. While say, the Roshi system probably didn't have a permanent defensive garrison larger than a regiment, it almost definitely harbored tens of thousands of reserve clones for much of the war, due to its position near the front lines on a crucial hyperspace route. Due to the sheer numbers of fronts the Clone Wars had open at any given time, more than half of the Grand Army was in some manner on the front lines for much of the war. The hardest pressed of the Rim commands, like the 12th Sector Army, likely had the vast majority of their strength committed to the front lines. The same was also true for some of the unremarkable core commands, like the 5th Systems Army, which shipped almost all of its clones off to the Rim to serve as reinforcements and left only a bookkeeping force behind. For some of the more stable Rim commands, like the 16th Sector Army, it was probably more of an even split between reserves and frontline troops. This dispersal didn't shift much over the course of the Clone Wars. The original 6th of the Grand Army that was in use for the first 2 months of the war probably focused on setting up defensive garrisons, leaving only small raiding units for offensive operations. This actually lines up with what we know of that time, as the campaigns in those first 2 months were almost entirely small sting operations. During the Outer Rim sieges, the focus shifted more towards offense. Large chunks of the defensive portions of core armies were sent off to Rim theaters during that time, especially to Mygeeto, Felucia, and Seleucami, the so-called Triad of Evil, as Palpatine put it. So, that's how the Grand Army of the Republic was dispersed across the galaxy, but as per usual guys, I want to know what you think. Would you be interested in more macro videos like this in the future? Let us know in the comments section below. And just before you go guys, make sure you check out the Discord if you want to connect with other Star Wars fans and have a chat with them. Our Geetsly's Gaming Network if you actually want to play games with other Star Wars fans on our Gary's Mod and our Roblox, and the Patreon if you want to help support the channel. If you do decide to donate, you get access to a special behind the scenes Discord where you can see how myself and the team work. Anyways guys, as always, thank you so much for watching and I hope to see you in the next video.